will be trouble.
Of course, machines can't think as people do. The machine is different.
Beer! What marvelous beer! How gratifying! How gratifying!
All right, thanks so much for having me. So normally when I'm giving a presentation, it's for a bunch of scientists and I have to keep the scope incredibly narrow. But today I'm going to take you on kind of a winding tour through a bunch of different things about bears all around the world, but focusing mostly back here on Minnesota. But there are three main things I want you to take away from my presentation today. The first is that there are a lot of other different species of bears besides the normal few that we think of in great need of conservation. Secondly, is that there's a lot of really cool research being done right here in the state on our own species, the American black bear, the only species we have here. And third, and probably most importantly, I want you walking away thinking, that guy is nothing like Timothy Treadwell. So let's start with the main player in our film tonight. The grizzly bear, or the brown bear, is really what the general species is called. A grizzly is simply a brown bear that lives away from the coasts. And so Timothy was able to make it with those bears as long as he did because he lived with Kodiak bears that were able to eat salmon year-round. They were fat, they weren't fighting for resources. He wouldn't have made it so long with grizzly bears, interior brown bears. But what you can see here from this map, this is from the IUCN, everywhere that's yellow is where brown bears currently live, and red is where they once lived at one point and no longer do due to all sorts of, different issues, usually from habitat loss though. So a lot of people don't even realize that they're spread all throughout Europe and Asia, and they even go down into the Gobi Desert. But the main thing to take away though is that this species as a whole is actually doing really well numbers-wise. They're really not very threatened. However, we hear all sorts of things about grizzly bears in Yellowstone needing conservation. And that is true. Luckily, we've had an incredible rebound from as low as under 100 individuals to over 700 in some. And some recent headlines where they're considering delisting the grizzly from the Yellowstone region because the Endangered Species Act really only focuses on here in the US. It doesn't really consider how many there are worldwide. But the issue here isn't that everyone agrees that the grizzly has made a great return in this area. But the problem is we don't know how they're going to fare under different climate changes from a changing climate, such as a loss of white bark pine, one of their primary foods. So to keep our tour moving, we're going to kind of skip over some of these guys. Here's our American black bear. We're going to circle back to them when we talk about Minnesota. But of course, everyone knows a lot about the polar bear, the symbol for climate change. And of course, the giant panda that only lives in the mountains of China. But we all know a good amount about all of them. So let's get to the ones that maybe you don't know quite as much about. We're going to stay here in the Western Hemisphere. This is the spectacled or Andean bear. Lives in the high mountain regions in the Andes. They have a great need for conservation as their habitat is shrinking as the climate warms. They basically stay on mountaintops, and that area is shrinking because they can't go any higher. And of course, there's a lot of issues with habitat fragmentation as well. Moving to Asia, though, we see here the Asiatic black bear. And if you look on our map here from the IUCN, there's a lot of red, meaning they've been extirpated from a lot of their range, typically due to forest deforestation. But you'll notice that these guys are most similar in appearance probably to our American black bear. But we can be thankful we don't have them in Minnesota like we have the American black bear. They're quite a bit more aggressive. Not that much is actually known about them outside of Japan. And the other, of course, distinguishing feature is that incredible chest blaze, and that's why they're known also as the moon bear. Staying in Asia, this is the sun bear. It's about the size of a large Labrador retriever, very short hair, almost completely subsists on fruit alone. But once again, these guys have really lost a huge percentage of their habitat. The yellow area there's a lot more red than there is yellow on that map. Once again, due to deforestation, and there's a lot of issues with poaching. Also in Asia, we have the sloth bear. These guys eat a lot of termites. Other than that, the sort of interesting piece about them is that they've had all sorts of conservation issues because they're stolen out of their dens when they're cubs, and they're basically trained to be quote-unquote dancing bears, where they're pierced through the nose and through the septum, and basically forced to stand on their hind legs and quote-unquote dance for tourists. This has been outlawed in India recently, fortunately, so the number of the cubs being taken for this purpose has dropped dramatically in the past several years. All right, but what I know best and what we're going to spend most of our time with is the American black bear. And what's really interesting about these guys is they're the only species of the 8 bears that we briefly talked about that their range and their numbers are expanding. They're actually repopulating areas where they have never been, where they were once or haven't been for decades. They have this sort of behavioral plasticity. They're able to get along with humans, which makes them, kind of a great survivor. They can eat basically anything, and there's less hunting pressure going on. So they've been re-expanding their range. And if we hone in here on Minnesota, if we look at kind of an outdated DNR map, we see primary and then the secondary habitat, kind of where the bears are pushing outward and expanding. And we have 4 sort of main active research areas within Minnesota. The first and the longest running is around Grand Rapids. And we're currently trying to understand how the bears are faring under a very different forest. Basically, there hasn't been much logging in the area where once there was a ton of logging. So how are bears faring with a lot more mature forest? There's actually less food for them, but better cover. So we're trying to understand what's happening there. Second is in Voyageurs National Park. We're trying to understand how a protected population kind of fares compared to the rest of the state where the bears can be hunted. And then looking at our southern boundary, this is at Camp Ripley. This is near Little Falls, and sort of understanding how they're doing at the southern end of the range. And then up here, this northwest corner, and this is where I did all of my field work and collected all my data for my PhD here at the University of Minnesota. And so this is sort of a bizarre place for bears, right? This isn't what you'd think of as typical bear habitat. This is a working landscape, primarily agricultural, with these tiny little patches of forest scattered about. And so what I did was we would set out these barrel traps, and they had several pounds of bacon inside. I was sometimes tempted to get in there with the bear, but the bears would crawl in for this bacon reward. The door would shut. We would have to drug them. We would collar them, and then we could track them. And I'll get into what all that means in a moment. But sort of the little side note here, if you saw the website, just previous to heading out to the field and trapping bears and collaring them and living out in northwest Minnesota, I was in Manhattan and Washington, D.C. doing very, very different things. And so here I am out in the field. We trap our first few bears, and the bear biologist for the state, my advisor, he's out there with me, showing me how to do it. He's training me and my field assistant. Things are going well. They're maybe 150 to 200 pound individuals, pretty easy to handle. And then he says, "All right, Mark, you're on your own. The next bear is for you and your field assistant to deal with." Of course, the very next one ends up being the largest bear ever collared in Minnesota. And that was quite the day I'll never forget. His name is Bernie, and he topped out at 600 pounds. So he's larger than most Yellowstone grizzlies. He's, of course, a corn-fed bear, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So these collars that we put on the animals, And these ear tags, it's sort of a trade-off. Yes, they have to get handled by us, but we ask hunters not to shoot them, so they end up actually having a longer life as a result of this. And what they provide us with is data on their locations every few hours. And so you can see here a map in northwest Minnesota. These are two different bears, but we have thousands of locations, and we know exactly where these bears were throughout the entire year. And based on that, we can kind of map it and then understand based on different mapping layers exactly what sorts of habitat, like this aspen forest, the bear was using, what they might have been eating, how they're using the landscape. Some of the interesting things we learned about these northwest Minnesota bears is they eat a lot of agriculture. They eat a lot of corn and sunflowers especially. And as a result of all these calories, they are the largest bears in the state. And they also benefit in terms of their reproductive ability. They have more cubs, they have cubs at an earlier age, and they have pretty high survivability. Now, these collars also allow us to follow the bears to their winter dens. And what we do there is we change the collar to make sure it's not hurting the individual. We take measurements, all sorts of different things that I'll talk about in a moment. But this is a typical den. This is just an excavation, a hole in the ground, and you might have walked by one of these in the woods and not even known it. That hole there is the entrance to the den. However, in northwest Minnesota, we saw some really bizarre things out there because it's pretty atypical place for bears. This bear built a nest for himself. That's actually a 400-pound male who built a nest out of cattails, just lying out in the open, exposed to the elements. They seem no worse for the wear, though, at the end of the winter. Another example of that. And so here's us crawling in the dens to, first we have to drug the animal, and then we take measurements and all those sorts of things. But one of the misconceptions here is that everyone's like, oh, you go in the dens? The bears are sleeping, right? Well, not really. Here's an example of sometimes what we would see. In bear language, that means I'm not happy you're here. This one is not a fan of the GoPro. We're also rewarded, though, while we change the mother's collar and take measurements, check on her health. We don't drug the cubs or anything like that, but we have to keep them warm. So, but we sometimes see this when we approach the den. And so one of the major areas of our study across the state, though, is we actually collaborate with medical researchers at the University of Minnesota and Medtronic. And so you can see here, these are some researchers taking a sonogram of the bear's heart. And what they're trying to understand here is bears basically, their metabolism shut down for the winter to try to preserve as much of their body weight as they can. They lose a lot of fat, yet they hardly lose any muscle mass in their heart. So this is important this has medical applications for humans, and I'll talk a little bit about that here. So sort of how are bears able to basically have their bodies shut down but yet hardly lose muscle mass? If you were a human patient in long-term care in a hospital, you would waste away and your heart would, the muscle in your heart would, deteriorate much, much more quickly. So if we can understand how bears are able to preserve heart mass, these are potential applications, even space travel. There's this hibernation induction trigger, so when bears feel this need to start hibernating in the fall, something in these opioid receptors tells them to do so. And so there's potential application for therapeutic drugs there. And wound healing. So when you're going to go into hibernate, you don't want any festering wounds, and if you say you got shot by a hunter or an arrow in the fall, you want to be able to heal from that as quickly as possible so that you're better able to maintain all your bodily functions while you're hibernating. So they have incredibly fast wound healing capabilities, and we want to understand how they're able to do so. It might have applications for humans, especially those that have, immunocompromised or other issues. And finally, and there's actually many others, but we're just beginning to tap sort of the remarkability of bear physiology and hibernation. But a final one here is wound formation. Bears do turn around a little bit in the den, but basically they're lying on their sides so often, and yet they hardly have any of this wound formation underneath their skin. So if humans are lying in a hospital bed for a long time, you have to constantly be turned to prevent bed sores, yet bears are somehow able to do this and not really form these quote-unquote bed sores.
I have a question.
Yes?
How exactly does a bear space travel?
Well, just understanding how their heart is able to slow down and maintain all their other functions might be useful for humans for space travel in the future. Yeah, that would be pretty awesome though. So we end up bringing a lot of equipment out to the dens with us. Here's a solar panel, a car battery, and all this. And what this allows us to do, all these contraptions, is basically stream data back from the bear's den back to our research facilities at the U of M, and basically have their data from the bear's heart coming back to us in real time. And we've seen some pretty remarkable things. We've seen bears have paused their heart between beats over 20 seconds. Their heart rate slows to as low as 4 beats per minute while they're hibernating. And so we're trying to understand how they're able to do this. But what's allowing us to even record all this are these Medtronic reveals, and there's all sorts of different iterations of these. These are really small, called biologgers, that get slid underneath a small pocket of skin in the bear. One suture seals it up, and then they heal remarkably quickly, as I mentioned, so it's about as minimally invasive as you can get. But it tells us a ton of things. And for example, this is from one bear. You can see this is its active time after it comes out of the den. We get 720 estimates of what the bear's heart rate is doing per day. And so you can see it ramping up as it comes out of the den and slowing down as it goes back to hibernation. But what I'm doing now, now that I finished my PhD and I'm working on these different postdoc applications, is trying to understand what's happening here. If we zoom in to just 1 day's worth of data, for example, from this heart rate stuff. So here on our y-axis is the heart rate in beats per minute, and time from just the length of 1 day. What's causing all this variability, all these fluctuations? There's all sorts of things going on there that maybe we can tease apart. And we do that, it's sort of a subfield of what's known as, we all know what conservation biology is. It's sort of utilizing science and policy and social aspects to try to preserve wildlife and ecosystems and habitats. But this sort of new subfield that's being allowed that's starting to flourish, it's thanks to these biologgers, not just cardiac, but there's all sorts of different ones that record things from animals' physiology, so we get a better idea of what's actually happening inside the animal as it's moving around its habitat. And so sort of the definition here, you can see it focuses on understanding and predicting how organisms, populations, ecosystems, and natural resources respond to environmental change and stressors. And I'll kind of explain that. And a stressor can be a lot of different things. It could be being chased by another animal. It can be crossing a road. And so what I'm doing is, the bears already are wearing GPS collars, so we know exactly where they are in real time. They email me their locations. It's sort of a great party trick. Show people your phone that a bear just emailed you. And then, of course, we're recording their heart rate as well through these reveals. And when we combine them, we can see, so there's this mother bear that, this is just outside of Little Falls, and that's Highway 10. It's a really busy highway. She crosses it constantly. So we're able to see what is her heart rate doing as she jumps back and forth across, highways and things like that. Another application for this red area is the impact zone where they launch artillery in Camp Ripley. And yet, the bears don't seem to care. Their location, these are two different mother bears that wander through this area while artillery is being shot out into this area. One even denned up in this area. And we're able to see what are their heart rates doing during all these military exercises. And it's sort of important because globally, military areas actually take up a lot more area act as larger nature preserves than nature preserves and national parks do around the world. So if we can understand how animals are responding to different things within military bases, we can maybe better manage them if they're near, say, an endangered species or whatnot. We can also understand how we're affecting the animals in general. We can see at what distance from the den, so once again, this is heart rate on our y-axis and time on our x. As we approach the den as researchers, we can then look back at the data and see how far away did the bear start becoming aware of our presence, so we can maybe better design like where we should keep people away from dens so we're not constantly bothering them. And you can see here somewhere between 38 meters and 20 meters, the bear's heart rate went from about 20 beats per minute to well over 100, more like 130 beats per minute. And the other thing we can see from this is this sort of slow decline here is after the animal had got drugged. So we can sort of understand how long are we affecting the animals after we handle them, so we can maybe better, change our practices so that we, leave less of an impact going forward. And finally, the last example I'll tell you about here is UAVs, or drones, are becoming really hot in wildlife conservation and ecology. They can do lots of different things for us. Here you see an example of flying over a seal colony, and they're counting them. They're able to get a population estimate a lot better than, say, flying an airplane through there. We're able to take really fine-scale 3D imagery of the landscape because of drones, a lot better than what we had been before. And of course, we've all heard of the snot bot that collected stuff that comes out of whales as they breathe. And so they're able to actually collect samples from them and look at how well they're doing in terms of their health. And finally, they're actually being used, especially in Africa, to deter poaching. The idea being a poacher isn't going to want to take an animal if he's being filmed via drone or whatever. So we knew we were sort of in a unique position having these heart monitors in the bears to see, well, how do these animals respond if we fly drones right by them? Because obviously all these other animals are having to experience it. We should probably learn, is there any negative impact before we just start doing this all over the place? So what we did is because of the bears wearing their GPS collars, we knew exactly where they were. They were emailing us their locations. We went out to the field. We programmed a little quadcopter drone, flew it to the last location we had from the bear, got it as close as we could, but maintained about 20 meters in altitude, had it fly around in circles over this location where we last had the bear. And then later, we were able to then download the heart rate data from the bear, and we knew in time and space where the drone was, where the bear was, and then we could see its heart rate. So we could see how was the bear responding both in terms of its heart rate and in terms of its location. Did it run away? Did it, move to a completely different area? Did it stand still and have its heart rate spike like crazy? And what we found is that they stood still most of the time, and their heart rates went through the roof when the drones went near them. So once again, we have the heart rate on the Y, and you can see this bear was resting in the fall. Heart rate was about 41 beats per minute, and when the first drone went by, jumped up to 162 beats per minute. So they definitely hear and are responding to these things, so we have to try to design scientific practices that minimize the impact on anything we're studying. And this study knocked two things off my bucket list. One being having some sort of scientific study I had done mentioned in the New York Times, but much more importantly, we got mentioned in the Onion. I don't know where else to go from here. I just put down. So yeah, you can look that up if you're interested. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you for having me, and of course, have a very nice day.